A superpower built its entire industrial heartland on a single titanic gamble. And if that gamble fails, the global economy could fracture. Right now, over 400 million people across China's most vital provinces rely on one river. Not just for drinking water, but for power, for food, for the factories that build the world's electronics. And for the first time in recorded history, that river is threatening to run dry. In the summer of 2022, an unprecedented heatwave brought the Yangtze River to its knees, exposing ancient statues on its bed and shutting down the world's largest power station. The water was gone. The lights went out. The assembly line stopped. What does it mean for the world when a river that supports a third of China's population simply stops flowing? Let us know your immediate thoughts in the comments below. That river was supposed to have been tamed. An engineering project so colossal it literally slowed the rotation of the Earth. A dam tasked with providing limitless clean power and ending the cycle of devastating floods. Forever, it was the ultimate insurance policy. But here's the terrifying secret. The river is still falling. The dam is now part of the problem. And 1.4 billion people are confronting a crisis that no amount of concrete can solve. We go deep into stories like this every week, and an incredible number of you watch until the end but forget to subscribe. If this kind of analysis is why you're here, take 1 second and hit that button. It's the single best way to ensure you don't miss our next investigation. It's that important. Let's begin. So, the fundamental question is not just whether China can save its most important river. It's whether the tool they built to control it is now accelerating its demise. The Yangtze River is not just a body of water. It is the cradle of Chinese civilization. In the national consciousness, it is the mother river, the Changjiang, the Long River. Its basin, which covers a staggering 1/5 of the country's land area, has been the agricultural and economic engine of dynasties for thousands of years. It flows over 3,900 miles from the glacial ice of the Tibetan Plateau, winding through staggering gorges and across vast fertile plains before emptying into the East China Sea. At Shanghai, more than 400 million people live directly within its watershed. That is more than the entire population of the United States and Canada combined, all depending on a single hydrological system. The river's basin is responsible for over 40% of China's GDP. It is the artery that carries iron ore, coal, and grain into the industrial interior, and ships finished goods, from laptops to electric cars, out to the world. To understand modern China is to understand the Yangtze. For centuries, the river was both a source of life and a source of immense destruction. Its seasonal floods were legendary and catastrophic, capable of displacing millions and wiping out entire harvests in a matter of days. The history of the river is a history of trying to contain its power. Levees, dikes, and channels were built, expanded, and rebuilt dynasty after dynasty. It was a constant war against nature, a war that was frequently lost. Then came the modern era, an era of unprecedented ambition. The People's Republic of China determined to showcase its engineering prowess and solve the river's dual nature once and for all, conceived of a project on a scale the world had never seen. The Three Gorges Dam. The idea was simple, but its execution was monumental. A single concrete wall, rising over 600 feet high and stretching nearly 1.5 miles across the river, would create a massive reservoir hundreds of miles long. It would do two things. First, it would capture the devastating summer floodwaters, holding them back and releasing them slowly, ending the ancient threat of floods for the millions living downstream. Second, it would use that immense hydraulic head, the pressure of the water held behind it, to power the largest hydroelectric station on Earth. The plan was precise, powerful, and, in the eyes of the state, perfect. It was the ultimate expression of humanity's command over nature. Construction began in 1994. It took 17 years, displaced over 1.3 million people, and submerged 13 cities, 140 towns, and over 1,300 villages. Entire landscapes were redrawn. It was a project of almost unimaginable scale and cost, both human and financial. The dam's statistics are staggering. Its 34 massive turbines have a total generating capacity of 22,500 megawatts. To put that into perspective, That is more than 10 times the power output of Hoover Dam. On a good year, it can produce over 100 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity, enough to power the entire nation of Belgium or a city the size of New York for a full year. This was meant to be the clean, renewable backbone for China's industrial revolution, powering provinces like Sichuan and megacities like Chongqing with seemingly endless hydropower. The promise was a future free from the whims of the river, a future of stable power, safe cities, and predictable shipping. For a time, it seemed to have worked. The dam held back major floods in its first decade of operation. The lights stayed on, the factories hummed, the great river had been tamed. Or so it appeared. But something fundamental was changing. Far upstream, on the frozen roof of the world, the river's source was beginning to disappear. The Yangtze originates in the glaciers of the Tibetan Plateau. That ancient ice, accumulated over millennia, acts as a natural water tower for much of Asia. It melts slowly and predictably in the spring and summer, providing a steady, reliable flow that feeds the river through the dry seasons. This glacial meltwater is the river's life insurance. It's what keeps it flowing even when rainfall is scarce. And that insurance policy is being canceled. Climate models are no longer theoretical. They are describing an ongoing reality. The Tibetan Plateau is warming at more than twice the global average rate. The consequences are stark. Glaciers that have been stable for centuries are now in a state of rapid retreat. At first, this process can be deceptive. A warming climate accelerates melting, which can temporarily increase river flow, creating a false sense of abundance. But it is a finite resource. Once a glacier melts, it is gone. The water tower is being drained. Scientists monitoring the region have issued increasingly dire warnings. The melt is accelerating. The long-term stability of the Yangtze's flow is now in genuine jeopardy. The river's very source is under threat. And that threat arrived far sooner than anyone expected. The summer of 2022 was not just a hot summer. It was an event without precedent in modern meteorological history. A stationary ridge of high pressure, a massive heat dome, parked itself over central and southern China for more than 70 consecutive days. Temperatures across the Yangtze Basin soared past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some areas approached 113. It was the most intense, widespread, and longest-lasting heat wave ever recorded in the country. Chongqing, a megacity of over 30 million people, saw its own record shattered. At the same time, rainfall simply vanished. The basin received 60% less precipitation than the seasonal average. A region that expects monsoons got a desert. The combination was catastrophic. The mother river, starved of both rainfall and its usual glacial supplement, began to recede at a terrifying pace. The effect was not gradual. It was a collapse. Major tributaries, like the Jialing River, shrank so dramatically that they became walkable. For weeks, the riverbed was exposed, a landscape of cracked mud and stranded fishing boats. The water level in the main channel of the Yangtze dropped to the lowest point since record-keeping began in 1865. In the city of Wuhan, downstream from the dam, the river was so shallow it became unusable for major shipping. The great artery of China was sclerotic. This isn't just a political or economic issue, it's a profound cultural moment. We're curious, have you seen stories like this from your own part of the world, where weather extremes are changing familiar landscapes? Share what's happening in your region in the comments. As the water fell, the river began to give up its secrets. In Chongqing, a 600-year-old Buddhist statuary, normally submerged by the rising waters of the reservoir, emerged fully from the riverbed for the first time. The triple statues, sitting on an island reef, became a haunting symbol of the crisis. They were a message from the past, a warning written in stone. The river was not just low, it was fundamentally altered, and the crisis was just beginning to unfold. The first domino to fall was power. The province of Sichuan, home to 84 million people and a critical hub for high-tech manufacturing, depends on hydropower for over 80% of its electricity. Its grid is powered, directly and indirectly, by the flow of the Yangtze and its tributaries. As the rivers dried up, the reservoirs behind the region's dams emptied. Power generation collapsed. At the Three Gorges Dam itself, the heart of the system, inflows dropped by more than 50% compared to the previous year. The dam was forced to slash its output to conserve what little water remained, prioritizing basic residential needs over everything else. The result was an energy crisis that cascaded across the economy with brutal speed. Sichuan province ordered a shutdown of nearly all industrial production for almost 2 weeks. This was not a selective blackout. It was a blanket order. Factories that supply some of the world's biggest brands went dark. Toyota, Volkswagen, and Foxconn, the assembler of Apple's iPhones, all announced temporary halts to their operations in the region. CATL, the world's largest manufacturer of batteries for electric vehicles, which supplies Tesla, Ford, and Bebel, shut down its Sichuan plants. The province is also a global hub for the production of polysilicon, a key component for solar panels, and lithium, essential for all modern batteries. Those supply chains seized up. The ripple effects were felt instantly around the globe. The prices of lithium carbonate shot up. Tech companies warned of potential delays in product launches. The shutdown demonstrated with brutal clarity just how interconnected the modern world is and how vulnerable it remains to a single point of failure in a place most Western consumers have never thought about. It was a stark reminder that the Made in China label on a smartphone or an electric car is often just another way of saying made with Yangtze River water. And what happens when that water isn't there? We see thousands of you watching, and many of you share this content with friends and family, which is incredible. If you find this breakdown valuable, hitting the like button and sharing it is the single best way to help others understand the scale of what's happening. And if they're anything like your family, they need to know. This wasn't just an industrial problem. It was a human crisis. In megacities like Chongqing and Chengdu, the power cuts were not abstract. They were real and terrifying. With air conditioning shut off, residents sweltered in the record-breaking heat. Office buildings were ordered to turn off their lights. Shopping malls reduced their hours. The iconic skylines of Shanghai, usually a blaze of light, went dark to conserve energy for the struggling grid. In rural areas, the impact was even more direct. The Yangtze Basin is China's breadbasket, producing nearly half of the country's crops. The drought decimated the autumn harvest. Rice paddies dried out and cracked. Corn stalks withered. The government was forced to allocate billions in emergency funds to support farmers and try to salvage what was left of the harvest. It was a multi-front crisis. Energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and shipping all brought to a standstill by the failure of a single river system. The great gamble on the Yangtze was failing. In response, the government scrambled to deploy solutions that seemed to come straight from science fiction. The most dramatic was a massive cloud seeding operation. Aircraft fired silver iodide rockets into the sky, a chemical agent designed to induce moisture in the clouds to coalesce and fall as rain. Provincial governments deployed rain-making drones and artillery shells. It was a technological war against the weather itself. In some areas, it produced brief, localized showers. But it was not a solution to a continental-scale drought. It was a desperate and ultimately insufficient measure. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. The other major response came from the dam itself. Water Ministry officials faced an impossible choice. The Three Gorges Dam reservoir, along with others farther upstream, held the region's last remaining water reserves. They could either hold that water back, hoping to save enough to get through the winter and protect the spring planting season, or they could release it now to try and alleviate the immediate crisis downstream. They chose to release. For weeks, the dam discharged precious water, raising downstream levels just enough to allow some critical shipping to resume and to provide relief to parched cities and farmlands. But every gallon released was a gallon they could not get back. They were draining their emergency savings account to pay for the current crisis, knowing that the account might not be refilled. The dam, designed as a fortress against floods, was now being operated as a hospice, carefully administering the last rites to a dying river flow. It was a strategy of managed decline. And let me remind you, because I know some of you are still on the fence, a lot of people watch our videos and simply forget to subscribe. I'm not judging, I've done it 100 times. But if you've made it this far, you are clearly invested in this story. Hitting subscribe takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps us continue these deep dives. Trust me, it's worth it. This exposes the fundamental paradox of the Three Gorges Dam. The project was sold as the ultimate solution to the Yangtze's volatility. By creating a gigantic reservoir, it was supposed to smooth out the river's dangerous peaks and its damaging troughs. But in doing so, it also made the entire region more dependent on a single, artificially managed system. It created a false sense of security. The existence of the dam encouraged even more industrial development in the region, drawn by the promise of cheap, reliable hydropower. It put more eggs in one basket. So when that system failed, it failed on a much grander scale than ever before. The dam amplified, rather than dampened, the consequences of an extreme climate event. Furthermore, the reservoir itself has a direct impact on the local climate. A body of water that large can alter weather patterns, affecting rainfall and temperature in ways that are still not fully understood. Some studies suggest that the dam contributes to more frequent and intense droughts in the region immediately surrounding it. The tool built to control the weather may be subtly, insidiously, making it worse. The 2022 heatwave was a preview, a stress test that the system failed. But the deeper, more existential threat remains the one brewing in the Himalayas. The long-term trajectory for the Yangtze is not defined by a single summer, but by the health of its glacial sources. And the prognosis is grim. Paleoclimate research, using data from ice cores and tree rings, shows that the Asian monsoon system has undergone dramatic shifts in the past, leading to megadroughts that lasted for decades. The stability of the last few centuries, the period in which modern China developed, may have been a climatic anomaly, a period of unusual wetness and reliability. The 2022 event may not be a freak occurrence. It may be a reversion to a harsher, drier mean, amplified by modern climate change. This is the scenario that keeps hydrologists and state planners awake at night. What if the river doesn't bounce back? What if the Great Drought of 2022 was just the beginning? The entire economic model of central China is built on a water budget that may no longer exist. The factories in Sichuan were built there for one reason: cheap hydropower. If that hydropower is no longer cheap or reliable, the entire logic of their location evaporates. Will industries be forced to relocate? Can they? The cost would be astronomical. It would mean unwinding decades of development and investment. And then there's the food. A permanent reduction in the Yangtze's flow would threaten China's food security in a profound way. The nation already faces significant agricultural challenges, and losing the productivity of its most fertile basin is not a scenario it can easily absorb. The political implications are immense. Water has always been a source of power and control in China. A government that cannot guarantee water and power to its industrial heartland and its most populous regions faces a crisis of legitimacy. The social contract is tested. This is why the state's response was so forceful, so desperate. It wasn't just about saving factories. It was about demonstrating that the central government was still in command of the situation, even as nature proved otherwise. The world watched as China, a nation at the peak of its powers, was brought to its knees by the weather. The event exposed a fundamental vulnerability at the core of a global superpower. The country that built the fastest trains, the tallest skyscrapers, and the largest dam in history was ultimately powerless against a silent, invisible dome of hot air. The Three Gorges Dam was supposed to be a symbol of triumph. In the summer of 2022, it became a monument to a miscalculation, a bet that engineering could overcome geology and climate, a bet that now looks increasingly like it was lost. China is not treating this as a one-off event. It is now in a frantic race to re-engineer its entire water and power infrastructure. The centerpiece of this new strategy is the South to North Water Diversion Project, an endeavor even more ambitious than the Three Gorges Dam. The plan is to build a series of massive canals, tunnels, and aqueducts to divert trillions of gallons of water from the water-rich Yangtze Basin in the south to the arid, heavily populated north, including Beijing. It is the largest water transfer project ever attempted. 2 of its 3 main routes are already partially operational, literally replumbing the geography of a continent. But this project is itself a gamble built on a flawed assumption that the Yangtze will always have excess water to give. The 2022 drought calls that entire premise into question. Diverting water from a river that is already under unprecedented stress only moves the problem around. It robs the South to pay the North, potentially creating new crises in the Yangtze Basin itself to solve old ones near the capital. It's a strategy that reveals the sheer desperation of the country's water planners. At the same time, China is engaged in a world-leading expansion of renewable energy that isn't dependent on water. It is installing solar and wind power at a rate that dwarfs the rest of the world combined. This is a direct response to the unreliability of hydropower. The government understands that its energy grid cannot remain so vulnerable to the climate. But building this new infrastructure takes time and staggering amounts of capital. And in the interim, the country remains heavily reliant on coal, which itself requires enormous amounts of water for cooling and processing. There are no easy answers. Every potential solution comes with its own costs and contradictions. More dams create more ecological disruption and evaporation. More coal exacerbates the very climate change that is causing the crisis. More water diversion projects simply shift the scarcity from one region to another. China is caught in a trap of its own making, a cycle of massive engineering projects designed to fix the problems created by previous massive engineering projects. The story of the Yangtze is not a cautionary tale for a distant country. It is a preview of a future that is arriving for everyone. It demonstrates that even the most advanced economies and powerful states are profoundly vulnerable to the rapid shifts in our planet's climate system. The infrastructure we have built, the assumptions our grids are based on, the locations of our cities, all were designed for a world that may no longer exist. The Three Gorges Dam was an engineering masterpiece for the 20th century. It solved 20th century problems. But it is facing a 21st century crisis, one for which it was not designed. The real question is no longer about any single dam or river. It is about whether a global system built on the assumption of endless growth and stable climate can adapt to a new reality of limits and volatility. The Yangtze River is not dead. The rains eventually returned, and the water levels have partially recovered. But the crisis left a permanent scar. A loss of confidence, a chilling realization that the systems designed to keep 400 million people safe and prosperous have a breaking point. The empty riverbed, the silent factories, the darkened cities, they were not a worst-case scenario. They were a dress rehearsal. The next time, it could be longer. The next time, the recovery may not be so quick. The world's factory floor sits on the banks of a river that is running out of time. And the clock is still ticking.